Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. This week, I'm continuing on with wrapping up my series I did on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge. This is part 2 of the wrap-up, so if you haven't listened to last week's episode, I highly recommend you do so. There, I started going through the presentations people had given on the various solutions of the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge. And this time, I'm going to pick up with Philip Swenson, giving his explanation of the simple foreknowledge solution. And a little bit of a funny note, I noticed that last week when I was recording this and I talked about how Philip Swenson had come on and talked about this and things, I had to go back through and edit out what I was saying because I kept saying Philip Swanson. And that's, I think, because during the past couple of weeks, my wife and I had been rewatching that show Parks and Recreation on Netflix, and one of the main characters there is Ron Swanson. So I think that was on my mind, and I would catch myself every time, but I kept saying that way. So hopefully I got all those edited out, and if I didn't, my apologies to Philip Swenson for messing that up. So anyhow, here's Philip Swenson talking about the simple foreknowledge solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge.
Why don't we just go right into what the simple foreknowledge view is? I've got a quote here from David Hunt I'll read, and you can tell me if you think this is a good summation of it or not. As I said, I had a little bit of a hard time finding resources on this, but this is what he said was a simple foreknowledge view, at least. He says, "What I'm committed to defending is the view that God simply knows the future, leaving open the question of how he does it. Mm-hmm. By simple foreknowledge, then I shall mean the view that the simple affirmation of, here we go, God has complete and infallible knowledge of the future is uncomplicated by expectations, additions, qualifications, etc., and that by itself is wholly compatible with human freedom, divine agency, and hence providential control. If the reader finds it useful in following the arguments to think of God as inspecting the future through a time telescope," that's his metaphor there, "this should do little harm so long as it is understood that's not part of the thesis I'm defending here." So he kind of seems to think it's just saying, well, it just is the case that God knows the future, and that just is compatible with human freedom, and you don't need to then start appealing to Molinism, open theism, Calvinism, or all these other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So I think, so you take it that way, then as you said, it might be compatible with Molinism or something stronger. But I think when people say they accept simple foreknowledge, a lot of times what they mean is mere simple foreknowledge. So I believe God has comprehensive knowledge of the future, but he doesn't have something stronger like what the Molinists or the Calvinists think he has, right? So he can't determine our actions and they still be free, like a certain type of Calvinist might think. And he doesn't know what would happen in every possible situation, right? Like the Molinist thinks. So he knows the future, but he doesn't have this greater type of control or knowledge.
Okay.
Other view. So that might make it, so I think, so we could call that mere simple foreknowledge, and that makes it kind of a unique position in a way, maybe.
Okay, I see. So I guess if I'm understanding you right, it's sort of like everybody who is an Orthodox Christian and agrees that God knows the future and humans have some type of libertarian freedom, more or less takes kind of a broad picture, simple foreknowledge view in that they all affirm those things. Mm-hmm. But then like the Molinist or the open theist then says, but there has to be some further explanation of this, and then dives into that where if I'm understanding what you're getting at with mere simple foreknowledge better, you're kind of saying, but we don't need to even dive into those things. In fact, maybe that's problematic and there's reasons we shouldn't.
Well, it's not that there's no deeper explanation. That maybe there is, maybe there isn't. It's that God doesn't have this even more robust type of control that the Molinist and the Calvinists think that he has. So he has the type of control that comes from knowing the future, but he doesn't have, this extra knowledge of like what you would do if he made a purple elephant appear in the room right now. He doesn't know that. So he can't use that like the Molinist thinks he can. And he can't just determine you to take a drink of water, to freely take a drink of water like the Calvinist, like a certain type of Calvinist might think. So it's like accepting that he has foreknowledge and denying that he has more is what I'm thinking of as mere simple foreknowledge, which makes it kind of a unique position in a way.
Yeah, it's so just to help me understand a bit more, are you saying then that like those further, well, no, they're not further explanations. You're rejecting kind of like stronger explanations, I guess would be a better way to say it, where you're saying, no, it's more, like you said earlier, much more moderate, where you're saying, well, yeah, God knows, but he doesn't know everything we're going to do in any given situation. Like the example I like to use is, if Molinism's right, God knows exactly what I would do if I was the president of the U.S., which is probably why I'm not the president of the U.S. But if it really is the case that I'm never going to be elected president in the future under mere simple foreknowledge, then no, God wouldn't know that.
Right,
or
exactly.
The deterministic Calvinistic view. Okay.
Right. So there may be a deeper explanation of how he knows what he knows. But he doesn't know these other further things that would be useful if he could know them. Yeah. He doesn't know what you would do if you were president or something. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then my question to you is, well, how does this work in solving the problem? Because it kind of, we should maybe distrust our intuitions a little bit, but it almost intuitively just seems like this is something that cries out for a little bit more of a explanation than just that, which is why there are all these views. So how does this go about solving the problem?
So simple foreknowledge isn't a solution to the problem. It's just a view about. It's just a view that says the problem can be solved, right? And then you could give many different types of solution to the problem. So what I'll try to do is explain what I think is a good solution that gets you simple foreknowledge, but won't necessarily get you Molinism or Calvinism or something.
Okay, cool.
Does that sound good? Or?
Yeah, I like that. But then I guess the caveat you would probably give is somebody else who takes the simple foreknowledge view might then have a different explanation than the one you're going to give us.
Exactly, right. So there are at least two different, or as I see it, there's at least two different types that people have given, and I like one of them more than the other. So I'll defend mine. And Well, please do. Dive right in. Okay, so
let us. Yeah.
So go back to this thought that the past is fixed, right? The past is beyond our control, where that means I can't do anything incompatible with the past. I take that to be what really motivates this problem. Look, God believed it a long time ago that I would take a drink. He can't be wrong. So I can't do anything incompatible with that, right? I can't do anything incompatible with what was true in the past. So I think we should ultimately reject that intuition. And we should say, actually, what's true is you can't do anything about what I call the independent past. The past that's true, independent, the facts about the past that are true, independent of what you do. And the reason, it seems so intuitive that the past is fixed is because we normally assume that the whole past is independent of our choices. But if what's true in the past could depend on what we do now, then I think it won't seem like the past is fixed. So start by thinking about a time travel story. So suppose whether time travel is really possible or not, right? Suppose you've come to believe time travel is possible, right? Maybe some physicists have convinced you, right? And they're like, look, this will work. And you think you're sitting in the time machine, and you think that if you push the red button, you'll appear in 1492. So suppose you believe all that. I think in that circumstance, it wouldn't seem to you like the past was beyond your control anymore. It would seem to you like you could determine whether somebody appeared in 1492 or not. You can think, yeah, I can push the button, and if I do, I'll appear in the past. If I don't push the button, nobody who looks like me will appear in the past. So the past really is under my control in a certain sort of way. And why would it seem that way? Because if you have a time machine, what happens in the past depends on what happens in the future.
Yeah, so, it's no longer fixed at that point. It becomes more like the future.
Backwards explanation where what happens in the future can explain the past. Like if you push the button, that would explain why someone appeared in the past. Then it doesn't seem like the past is beyond our control anymore. Any questions about that so far? Is that kind of making sense?
Yeah, I can see how that would, if I believed all that, then I wouldn't think the past is fixed anymore. But then my mind goes to, well, but is it really that way? Like, okay, you've shown me that that's the way I think about it, but is the way I think about it really matching up with reality? Yeah,
good. So maybe tell me if this isn't getting at your question, but my thought is I want to say that the existence of God, the existence of an essentially omniscient being, functions kind of like the way a time machine functions, where it creates this link between the future and the past. The fact that in the past there exists this essentially omniscient being makes it the case that the past can depend on the future in certain ways. So just like things get weird if there's a time machine, things get weird if there's an essentially all-knowing being in the past, because then what I do now actually affects what happened 1,000 years ago, because it affects what God believed 1,000 years ago. So if you're a theist who thinks God's essentially omniscient, then you should think, oh yeah, turns out we do live in this weird kind of world that's kind of like a world where time travel is possible.
Okay, so in a certain sense, you would take a variant of the problem of divine foreknowledge that atheists would use to say, see, there is no God, and you'll turn it on his head and say, no, this if you're already committed to the idea that there is a God, what this shows us is that there's some type of backwards causation going on, so to speak.
Yes, good, or at least backwards dependence or backwards explanation going on, where somehow what I do now is sort of prior to the past in a certain way, where what I do now can explain why the past is the way that it is.
Okay.
And that's because of the weirdness of an essentially all-knowing being, right? That's a very interesting thing to have there in the past.
I don't think I've heard that. I don't think I've heard that before. That's very interesting.
And because simple foreknowledge is kind of a odd view, as Philip was saying there, it's not even really a solution. It's more of a broad category that allows for some other kinds of solutions. I thought it would be useful to include this little clip here where he's giving kind of a practical explanation of how this would work, more of a practical example. So that's the next clip here.
Praying about things that have already happened, right? You get an email, you check your email, you see that last night your friend was going into surgery. You know surgery's probably over already, but I think on the simple foreknowledge model, it would make sense for you to pray now that God, protect him during surgery. That could explain God's past belief that you will pray in the future, and then that belief could explain his protecting him in the surgery. So I think that's real that you don't get on open theism.
I actually did that when I was a kid, not in reference to surgery, but my dad's a pastor, and so he had some missionaries come to the church, and they were going to be like children's missionaries in it was some country in South America. I don't remember exactly which one. And they sent a newsletter to the church where they talked about how they were going to go hold a kids crusade at this certain village or whatever. And I kept praying as a little kid, I think it was 7 or 8, for that kids crusade they were going to hold, even though I knew at a certain point they've already done it, because my thinking at the time was, well, I figure God can, take my prayers now and make it work in the past because he's God. I didn't have all these philosophical and theological reasons for it, but that's kind of how I thought about it as a little 7, 8-year-old kid. Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
good. So that I think that would make sense on the simple foreknowledge model. So that might be an advantage of it.
I guess we can say that when I was 7 or 8, that's the viewpoint I took then. So.
So you knew this all along.
Apparently, yeah. Okay. All right.
So, I learned a few things here about simple foreknowledge that I did not know before. If you'd listened to the other episode, you'd heard me describing it as making God kind of causally effete, where it turns the past into the future, and since the past is deterministic, therefore the future is deterministic. Well, after listening to Philip talk about it, I'm sure you realize that I was right in my assessment that it turns the future and makes the future and the past alike, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that it makes them both deterministic. What Philip is trying to appeal to is saying, well, we see the future as kind of, in a certain sense, open in that we can cause it and we don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And he says we should then reject our intuition that the past is set. We should then sort of think about it as he said, God makes things kind of weird like a time machine. So with God being omniscient, why not think that you can change the past? Now, I find that kind of hard to get my head around. And it's not that I don't understand what he's saying. I follow his points there. It's that there seems to be something very counterintuitive about the idea that we can change the past like that. And I know what Philip is then going to appeal to is, like I said, well, since we have an omniscient God, that changes things, that makes things weird. And I guess I'm sympathetic to that, but I'll get some more into this when I get into critiquing these views. But anyhow, point here is I was wrong about the simple foreknowledge view, and broad simple foreknowledge, like I was saying and like he agreed with, I think that's something that all Orthodox Christians should be willing to accept, because all that claims is God knows the future and human beings are free. And that's pretty much Orthodox Christian doctrine as far as I know. The only ones who I'm aware of who would doubt that would be the Reformed or the Calvinistic viewpoint, because they don't claim that we're free, at least not in the same sense. Although, to be fair, they do claim that we're free. They just redefine freedom to mean to do what you want to do, which I went through that at the start of last week's episode where Tim Carter and I disagreed quite a bit on that. Okay, so before I get into the critiques of the views and giving my opinions, there's one other relevant topic that came up that I thought I should play a clip of, and that's the various theories of time. There's an A theory of time, there's a B theory of time, and both Alan and Philip got into that a bit with me because your viewpoint of what time is and how it works and which theory of time you take is actually going to affect which solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge you find compatible or not. I don't have a clip of it here, but Philip rejects the open theism viewpoint simply because he has a view of time called eternalism, where the future really is there, so therefore open theism has to be wrong, because open theism says at least some parts of the future aren't set. Well, if the future exists just as much as the present and the past, then open theism is wrong, and Philip thinks it does, therefore open theism is wrong. And so here's a clip of Alan and I discussing some of the various theories of time, because he brought that up as an example of a odd philosophical viewpoint he holds. And it's very relevant to the discussion here, even though it kind of came up organically. So here's that clip.
Hold to that you think you can defend pretty well that other philosophers just don't think much of.
One view I hold, it's not quite in the mainstream with respect to philosophy of time, but it's definitely a well-represented position, is that I'm a presentist. That is, I believe that everything that exists at the present. Past things no longer exist. Future things do not yet exist, so they aren't part of the ontology. There are probably the majority of people who work in the metaphysics of time hold to some version of a block theory of time, which says that, in addition to the present events, there are past events and future events, and they're all equally real, even if we don't currently experience them the same way. And one place where I apply presentism that your viewers may find interesting, and I wrote a paper on this, is I apply it, well, with this one objection that people sometimes raise against presentism is, how do you ground truths about the past? Right? If the past no longer exists. And one of the moves I make there that is I appeal to the memories of God. That the truth makers for truths about the past are God's memories. Because God experiences all events as they occur and retains a perfect kind of recollection of everything that occurs.
Interesting.
So that's my, if you ask me like what the presently existing ground for the truth, for truths about the past is, then that's what I'm going to offer as a truth maker.
Yeah, that's interesting. That reminds me of some variants of Christian idealism that say things like everything that exists is just a thought in the mind of God or something like that, which is, you're not quite going that far, but it's
I don't want to say that.
Seems similar. Yeah. And that block theory of time you're referring to, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that commonly referred to as the B theory of time, where presentism, what you're taking, is more commonly referred to as like an A theory of time? Do I got that right there, or have I reversed those?
Yeah. There's so a block theory, and there's different kind of versions of this, but on the majority one just says is also known as eternalism. It says that past, present, and future events are all equally real. So if you could view all of reality from a God's eye perspective, you would see all of the temporal events just kind of laid out before you. And from that perspective, there is no real becoming or passage of time. That's just an illusion.
Okay.
According to all versions of the A theory, and there are several, becoming is objective. It's not an illusion. So if you surveyed all of reality from a God's eye perspective, there would be real observable change. The ontology of reality is non-constant.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I thought about it before, where you can, I think loosely speaking, you could say that presentism, or the A theory of time, that's kind of how the average man who doesn't study philosophy and metaphysics and physics thinks about time, where it just naturally seems apparent that, well, things come into existence, I was born, and they go out of existence. One day I'm going to die. Where the B theory of time is a little bit more radical in the sense that it says something about our perceptions there is off. What we're perceiving is not really how things really are.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And that, I don't think that necessarily means the B theory is wrong, but that's just a good way to describe and categorize them, I thought.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so it seems foolish to me now that I hadn't thought of this before, but the discussions I had on time with Alan and Philip there made me realize that whatever view you take of time is going to radically affect what you think about the problem of divine foreknowledge. It's going to necessarily rule in certain views and rule out other views. So it seems to me that block theory or eternalism, the idea that the future and the past are just as real as the present, or there's some variants of block theory that are a little weird that might say like the past and the present are real but not the future, and other things like that. Well, block theory or eternalism that says the future is just as real as the past and the present, that seems to me it's going to kind of necessarily commit you to something like simple foreknowledge, or maybe a very deterministic viewpoint, something along the lines of a Calvinistic viewpoint that's deterministic. Whereas if you're thinking, hey, the future isn't set, it's not real, then you could consider viewpoints like open theism and Molinism and things along those lines. And conversely, it also seems to me that even if you did take a very deterministic viewpoint, if you did accept Calvinism, and to be fair, Calvinistic proponents don't say it's deterministic, at least not all of them do. But anyhow, even if you did take something like that, I don't think it would necessarily commit you to a block theory of time or eternalism. It just seems to me that it's the other way around, where if you do buy into eternalism or block theory, and if my memory serves me correctly, Philip Swinson did buy into eternalism, that was how he described his view of time. Well, if that's the case, then you really have to go with simple foreknowledge or some type of deterministic viewpoint. So anyhow, I feel foolish that hadn't occurred to me before because it seems so obvious now, but hey, I learned something, and that was one of the whole points of doing this. Okay, so now comes the part I'm sure everybody's actually been waiting for, the really fun part where I'm going to start offering my critiques of these views and trying to come to some conclusions in my own mind about which of these views work, which ones don't, and which one, if any of them, at the end of it all, I end up buying into. Because hopefully, for those of you who've listened to all of this, I came across like I had a pretty open mind to most of them. That is, at least it seemed to me anyway, as I re-listened to them all, that I was agreeing with and conceding good points that all of the proponents made and disagreeing and challenging them appropriately. So if I did my job well up to this point, you probably can't tell which one of the viewpoints I buy into the most. And that's at least partially because I'm really not totally sure either. I'm kind of seeing where this goes. So one of the first criteria I'm going to use for attempting to figure this out is I'm not going to take any viewpoint that seems obviously counterintuitive to me. And what I mean by that is we all have certain intuitions about what's right and what's wrong and what's obvious and what's not. And you've heard me talk about these things with other people before many times on the podcast, both in the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge and other things. Like the example I'm remembering from when I was talking to Peter Razor is we might think just intuitively that the world is flat because that's the way it appears. But we know that's wrong because there's very good arguments, evidence, and examples that show no, the world is a sphere. That's very, very apparently evident, even though if you were to just depend on what your eyes show you only, you might come to the conclusion that it's not a sphere. And so what I mean by that is your intuitions and what seems intuitively obvious, that's not always right. But I do think, and I'm pretty strongly committed to this idea, that in the absence of a good defeat or a good reason to doubt what seems immediately obvious to you, you're justified in believing what seems immediately obvious to you. So right now, you're listening to my podcast in some way. That seems immediately obvious to you. You're listening on your phone, on your computer, or in some way. Well, I don't think you're justified in doubting that you're listening to my podcast right now. And if somebody were to come along and try and claim otherwise, like, oh, you're in the Matrix, you're being deceived, or something relatively crazy like that, I think they'd need to give you a very, very strong defeater to prove that. And so, likewise, there's some things that just seem intuitively obvious to me, and people would need to give me very strong defeaters to counter those. And the first one of those things is, it seems pretty obvious to me that we really do have free will in a sense. Now, you can throw caveats at it like Tim did when I was discussing this with him and say, well, libertarian free will may not be a good way to describe it because it seems to imply we're freer than we really are. We are all certainly influenced to degrees by various things, and none of us have maximal autonomy. I can't go outside and fly. But the immediate experience that I and pretty much everybody else I've ever talked to has is we actually are free. We do make decisions. I'm responsible for my decisions, even when I was influenced by other things. And the example I'm sure you heard me give numerous times in this series was, well, I want to drink coffee, and I'm much more likely to drink it if I smell it brewing or see a good coffee shop or something like that. So that influenced me, but it's still my decision to go there or not, and I could refrain from doing it. In fact, I can remember some times in the past I was hanging out with people who'd known me for years, and they offered me a cup of coffee, and for whatever reason, that particular time, I turned them down. And they were surprised because that's not a typically Phil thing to do. That's not normal for me. So my point here is that the fact that we have free will in some sense, whether you want to take that strongly or weakly or whatever, the fact that we have the ability to make a choice to do this or not do that, to have the cup of coffee or refrain, or to do the immoral act, or to do the virtuous thing, that's just seems very readily apparent to me, and from all the discussions I've had with other people, it seems readily apparent to almost all of them as well. Even people who tend to take a very deterministic view of life even people who tend to take a very deterministic view of things philosophically and theologically, they still behave as if that is so. And so it follows, at least it seems to me anyway, that if you're going to claim that, well, we're not free in that sense, life is deterministic, or as Tim claimed with the Reformed viewpoint, you're only free in the sense that you get to do what you want to do, well, I think the burden is then on you to show that. You have to then find a way to show why I'm not free, and maybe even why I then have the immediate experience, the immediate awareness that I am free if I'm not. Why am I deceived? And not only why is, Phil deceived, because, hey, I've been wrong about lots of things, but why is it the vast majority of human beings have all had this experience and we're all wrong? And to my knowledge, I don't think anybody has done that. And as Jonathan Studi quoted, Aquinas actually agrees with me here.
Article 1, but it's in the corpus, or the main body of the article. St. Thomas says, I answered that. Man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. And now, what St. Thomas is doing here is reveals two things. One, he's actually hearkening back to St. Augustine's work on grace and free will, which, if you haven't read that, it's excellent. And it's a dialogue between St. Augustine and I think a guy named Tractius. It's been a few years since I've read it, but that's just St. Augustine's reply is that, of course we have free will, because otherwise when God punishes us or when we reward somebody, all of that would be in vain. All of that would be just ridiculous and unjust from an objective point of view.
Yep, that was when I talked to Tim Carter about the Reformed or Calvinist perspective. That's what I tried to come back on him and say, well, look, if God determines that we do everything and then he punishes me for doing wrong, that's unjust, because I could not have done anything different. It's only just for God to punish me for my sins if I could at least potentially have not sinned. And God is certainly not unjust. So
right, of course.
So I think I just have to reject the Calvinistic or Reformed viewpoint because it's counterintuitive to what seems immediately obvious to me, and I'm unaware of any good arguments it's given to make me doubt what seems obvious to me. And furthermore, it does seem to me that this, in a certain sense, makes God unjust, because he ends up punishing us for things that he determined that we were going to do. There really would be no way for me to get out of doing my sins, yet God would still punish me for them. And so that seems to make God unjust. Now, Philip Swenson, when I was talking to him, he had an interesting idea where he said, well, maybe the Calvinists could get out of that by then saying that, by being a universalist, by saying that in the end God does save everyone, which, hey, I think that might work there with the idea of it being unjust. But at the same time, I'm unaware of any Reformed or Calvinistic theologian or philosopher who is a universalist. In fact, the ones I'm aware of who engage with issues on hell find universalism to be kind of an abhorrent position. So I don't think that's a way out for at least most of them, at least not one they seem ready or willing to take anyhow. So moving on here a bit, it did seem to me that both Alan and Philip offered some pretty insightful and possibly devastating critiques to Molinism. Well, I'll get into whether or not they're devastating, but they were very good critiques and very good substantive objections. So I'm going to play you two clips here of Alan and then Philip offering their critiques of Molinism, and then I'll go on and deal with that.
One, I think that is independent of it, that is also decisive, is that it does not and cannot solve the problem of divine foreknowledge that it purports to. Right?
Oh, how's that?
So the Molinist, wants to do two things, right? They want to have a strong view of divine providence, right, where God is kind of meticulously in control of every little thing that happens. God and they want there to be true future contingency.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Well, they've got a problem here, because if you recall the way I laid out the fatalistic argument, right, you need two things to have a successful argument for fatalism. You need a future specifier, and you need that specifier to be now unpreventable.
Mm-hmm.
Well, God's creative decree on the Molinist account is a future specifier. God is decreeing a complete history, right? All the details. That's part of his decree. It's informed by his middle knowledge, but it's, his decree specifies all that and gives rise to his free knowledge, which is also a future specifier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, fine. But that decree, in order to have the providential oomph that the Molinist wants it to have, has to be now unpreventable.
Mm. Oh,
right.
Okay. I think I see where you're going, yeah.
If you say that it's preventable, then Molinism collapses into Ockhamism. It collapses into something like the simple foreknowledge view.
Mm.
You lose every providential advantage that Molinism is supposed to have. So either Molinism collapses into theistic determinism, or it collapses into Ockhamism. It's an unstable position.
Hmm.
That's probably is my chief objection.
I haven't heard that critique of Molinism before. That's interesting. I've always heard people talk about the grounding objection. So,
yeah, the grounding objection is the most well-known one, and I like that one too. There's also a kind of explanatory priority thing, but I think a dilemma I raise is quite decisive. That the Molinism's unstable, right? It's you can't have your cake and eat it too.
I see.
Something's got to give there.
I think the only way I could see around that then would be to say that somehow the way you've categorized the problem of divine foreknowledge, your argument for theological fatalism, there's something wrong in how you're doing that.
I would challenge the Molinists to try to poke a hole in that. I don't think they can, but yeah, I think you're right that that's where the debate would probably move.
And then Philip offered a very, very similar critique to Alan's.
But they Molinists must think that there is some solution. Okay, so here's why I'm not a Molinist anymore, even though I see how nice it is. So I think there's a dilemma for Molinists.
Mm-hmm.
So dilemma goes like this. Either things beyond our control guarantee what we will do, or you have explanatory loops or explanatory circles. So suppose God makes you president because he sees what you would do if you were president, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now here's the question. Is it up to you what you would do if you were president? If it's not, then the fact that God made you president, plus the fact that that you would pass a certain policy if you were president, those two things together entail that you create that policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's not up to you what you would do if you were president, then I think you're not free. There's things beyond control. The fact about what you would do, plus God's decision to put you in the situation that guarantee that you'll do that. And to me, that seems like you're not free anymore.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So that's one half the dilemma. If it's not up to you what you would do. But now suppose it is up to you what you would do if you were president, right? Well, then it looks like we have an explanatory loop. God makes you president because of what you would do. But then what you would do if you're president is true because of the choice you make when you're president. You get to decide what you would do. Well, then it looks like we have a loop, right? You're president because of what you would do, and you do what you do because you're president. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we definitely want to try and avoid explanatory loops. Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
so
yeah.
Dilemma that got me off of Molinism.
So it does seem to me that, although they phrased it and categorized it a little differently, Philip and Alan are both pointing at the same problem here, which is more or less, if God puts you in a position because he knows what you will choose, and therefore he gets what he wants because of this middle knowledge that Molinism appeals to, but he does that from the very beginning of creation, and he only set the world up because he knew that's what you would do, well, then you kind of wind up with an explanatory loop or explanatory problem there. Now, both Alan and Philip separated this problem from the grounding problem of Molinism, and the grounding problem loosely is that where's this middle knowledge come from? Peter and I talked about this a bit in the episodes I did on Molinism with him, but if Molinism is true, then God's going to have knowledge of all kinds of contingencies that don't even exist. So it's entirely possible that instead of my parents having me, they might have had a daughter. Well, then God would have to know everything about who that woman would be, what she was like, what her preference would be, what she would do if she was president, not just me, and so on and so forth. So there's an infinitesimal range of possibilities that God would have to know. And the grounding problem is, well, this other woman who my parents might have had instead of me, she doesn't exist. So how could God possibly know that? So as I said, both Alan and Philip separated their objections from the grounding problem, and they both like the grounding problem as an objection as well. But I can't help but wonder, as I thought about this a bit, if these objections aren't really connected. That is, suppose you can find another grounding for why God would be doing these things. That is, why God would decree that the world would be this way and not this way, other than the middle knowledge. And so that makes me wonder if this isn't somehow connected to the grounding problem. And perhaps Philip and Alan will disagree with that, but it does seem like maybe there's a connection there to me. So perhaps if we could solve the grounding problem, that might give us some insight as to what to do about Philip and Alan's objection. So in that light, I'm going to move on to the conversation I had with John Limanto on Molinism, because I thought that he offered in that conversation a very, very good response to the grounding objection to Molinism. So I'll just play that here now.
How can you have a grounding? How can you have a truth-making property for a counterfactual if there's nothing in reality to ground it to tie it to?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, for people who aren't familiar with the philosophical language, when we're talking like we are now, when we're using words, most words are a referent to an actual thing. Like if I talk about my computer, well, my computer's right here. I talk about John, well, you're sitting there in Indonesia on the other side of the world right now. There's a referent to the words I'm using. That's because the referent actually really exists. Where the problem, what we're getting at here with the grounding objection is, there doesn't seem to be a referent for these counterfactuals. There doesn't seem to be anything in the actual world where we can say this is what grounds it. Yeah, so I think you've described the problem pretty well.
Yeah, so the standard Molinist response to this is really to question the assumption that all things really need to correspond, or at least to be made true, by something that is concrete. And let me put it this way. So there are statements that we deem to be true, although they are not made true by something that is concrete, that exists. And by concrete, I mean something that is causally active. For example, like your dog is a concrete object. Your dog isn't an abstract object, or
as we all heard from embarking. Yeah,
it simply means that your dog is causally active. It can cause something, And so, for example, but the problem is, like, a lot of things, a lot of statements that we make really do not abide by this rule. For example, if I were to say there exists no unicorns. When I'm making that statement, I'm making a statement about something that is true, which is that unicorns don't exist. But what makes true the statement unicorns don't exist? Well, that's problematic because you see now that we're coming to a case in which our referent isn't really a concrete object. Now, here's maybe another interesting one. Suppose that we have, suppose that I have my glass. I have a window and it's made out of glass, and so suppose that I'm throwing a ball at it, and I'm throwing a ball at it, and I know the following counterfactual. I know the counterfactual that if the ball were to hit the window, the glass would break and shatter to pieces or whatever. That counterfactual is grounded. You can ask that counterfactual is reasonably true, which is that if I throw a ball to my window, then the glass will break, the window will break. And so, but what makes true the statement? Well, we might say it would be the molecular structure of the window. The molecular structure of the glass makes it that it's fragile, and so if you throw a ball at the glass, it will break. But the problem is, notice that it's not only the glass, the molecular structure, but it is likewise the law of nature surrounding it. The law of nature, which is the law of nature that describes that this glass will break if a certain ball were to hit it or whatever. But the problem is now we come to another statement that is also not grounded in a causally active concrete object, which is law of nature. Anything that constitutes law of nature, for example, the law of gravity, is not a concrete object. You don't have an entity that really exists, which we call the law of gravity, that we point to and say, oh, that's the law of gravity. And so that's the sense in which we talk about that sometimes some of our statements really do not refer to concrete entities or concrete objects. And so if that's the case, what I would like to propose is that the Molinists here can have no problem, because they can just say that, like the laws of nature, we have counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that are grounded in this state of affairs. So let me distinguish that for a second. We have entities that we introduced earlier, or objects that we said, or states of affairs. States of affairs really can just be they're the exemplification of a certain proposition. So you can have the state of affair of Socrates playing a flute, for example, which is really the state of affairs, which is the exemplification of the proposition that Socrates is playing a flute. So in such a case, then you can have a case in which you have a proposition and you use what's called as the disquotational principle. What you really is doing is you're taking the state of affairs out of that proposition. So the proposition Socrates is playing a flute, and then the state of affairs of Socrates playing a flute. And so you can derive a state of affairs out of any proposition. And so what the Molinists can do is Molinists can also propose a state of affairs of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. This is the same thing as if you're saying that there are state of affairs of laws of nature. If I say that there is a state of affairs of that the apple will fall if I drop the apple, then that's a state of affairs which correspond to a law of nature. And likewise, it's the same thing with counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. They work like laws of nature in the sense that they're non-concrete entities, but they can still be grounded in a state of affairs. So I hope that analogy there is clear. Yeah. So far, do you think it's a clear way of putting it?
I think that's a very good response. It's very similar to the problem of universals in philosophy, where the easy example of that is we all want to say that there's a color blue, but you've never actually seen the color blue disconnected from things. You'll see it on your computer screen. You'll see a blue car. You might see blue water depending on how the weather is that day. you never see blue just by itself. So then the problem is, well, we all want to say that blue exists, but really does it? All you've ever seen are the particular examples. Yeah. And so what you're getting at is very similar to that, where, well, we want to say things like the laws of nature exist, like the law of gravity, the various laws of physics that be involved with the window shattering, for obvious reasons. But have you ever actually seen or observed the law? No, you've observed lots of individual instances, and then you kind of abstract and infer from that law is there. And so what you're saying is we're going to do something similar with the counterfactuals and say, well, they're like the universals, they're like the laws of nature, where, yeah, you can't really look at them in this grand sense and say, aha, but you can point to lots of little individual instances and then kind of infer from that.
That's actually,
is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, the last part where you said that we can infer counterfactuals from what we perceive from the counterfactuals we see in real life, I think that's a very interesting one as well, because we do see that laws of nature, we infer to laws of nature from certain phenomena that we see in our world, and then we infer from it that therefore there are laws of nature, although we really don't know what grounds it or whatever.
We've never observed the law of gravity. What we've observed is matter attracts matter, things fall down all the time, and from that we've inferred the law of gravity.
Yeah, and I think it's one way as well, one good way to try to argue for Molinism is to say that even if you don't know the grounding for it, you can argue for it in the same way that you argue for example, the existence of laws of nature, because you see phenomena that are so similar to it in real life. For example, that I see, that I know that certain people in my life will never ever in their life eat a burrito because that's just not good for them. And so what an example of this can then be extrapolated to, for example, deriving that there are these counterfactuals even though we don't know the grounding for it. Now that's another way to put it. But what I was getting at earlier was that we do know the grounding for it, and the grounding is really just the state of affairs of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which is the same thing as the state of affairs of laws of nature that we described earlier. But, well, I think that point is very helpful, though. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, so I haven't worked out all my thoughts on this yet, but just kind of intuitively, it seems to me that Alan and Philip's objections kind of are tied to the grounding objection in some way. Just if you take Philip's objection at face value, his dilemma there, well, if you can find some other way to ground why it would be that God would decree the world is like this and not like that, other than the middle knowledge that he's then using to get us to do the things that he wants us to do for his divine providence to work out, well, then that dilemma kind of goes away. And so that, at least kind of intuitively, seems to tie to the grounding problem to me. And so I haven't quite worked out all the details in my own mind, because this kind can get pretty complicated, as you can see. But I wonder if we couldn't apply something about like the response that John gave to the grounding objection there to Philip and Alan's objection, and then turn around and say, well, God has this middle knowledge of us that he knows us so well that he knows what we're going to do in any given situation because he made us, and he can infer from that in the same way that we infer about universals and gravity and things like that. He can infer from that what we're going to do, and that is the grounding. And because we've argued and established before in other parts of this podcast and other parts of the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge podcast that there's no necessary connection between the knowledge and the causation, therefore you have something that works. Now maybe it doesn't end up working. Again, there's a lot of complicated factors and philosophical nuance in this that I haven't quite wrapped my mind around yet. I'm trying to, but this stuff is pretty difficult. So anyhow, so I'm thinking maybe that's a route we could go to make Molinism work. I'm sure Alan and Philip will respond and say, no, you can't, that doesn't work. But anyhow, that's kind of where my thoughts are at on Molinism at the moment. Is maybe you can make a similar appeal to that for Molinism as you can for something like moderate realism in the problem of universals. Okay, so moving on to the next view, I thought Alan did offer a pretty decisive objection to the Thomistic viewpoint. And all respect to Jonathan Studi here, I appreciated him presenting that viewpoint, but I do think Alan offered a very decisive critique, so let me play a clip of that.
Somewhat the context of maybe like Thomism or something, but or Boethius's view, but the timelessness view doesn't solve the problem because of divine foreknowledge, because the problem, as I stated, it has nothing to do with time.
Yeah,
Nor does it have anything to do with the so-called distinction between, say, horizontal and vertical types of causes.
I'm glad you're bringing that up, because when I talked to my friend Jonathan Studi about this, who's a Thomist, he was actually the guy out on before you, that was the exact distinction he appealed to. He agreed, timelessness, that doesn't matter, but then he wanted to make that distinction you're talking about now, so...
Yeah, I think that the distinction between kind of the horizontal and the vertical, or between the creature to creature causation and the divine to creature, and the God to creature causation, is irrelevant. Just like the temporality issue is irrelevant, because the problem, as formulated, doesn't have any premise that asserts anything about the horizontal or vertical direction of causation. All it says is that you've got a future specifier and it's now unpreventable. So take the total kind of causal nexus that's in play. That is the horizontal and the vertical. Let's lump them all together. Do those dictate a unique, complete future? If they are, then they're a future specifier. Are they preventable? Well, not unless God is passible in some respects, and Thomists don't want to say that.
No, definitely not.
So the Thomism, if it's orthodox, like Thomism, is a version of theistic determinism. It collapses into theistic determinism. It's you can't consistently be a libertarian and be a Thomist.
And so Philip Swenson had pretty much the same objection to the Thomistic response as Alan gave there, although he gave it in a slightly less technical way. And that's that Philip said, hey, anything that says, no, you can't do that, anything that says you must do this and prevents you from having a choice, that impairs your freedom. And so simply making a distinction where you're looking at it as I recall the analogy that Jonathan used when I was talking with him was, if I want to move my leg is then moving things, but it's me who's orchestrating it. And that's kind of similar to God, where I'd then be like my leg and God would be like my mind that's causing my leg to move. But the problem where that seems to break down is, as I was talking about it with Philip, well, my leg is generally not in a position to tell me no, where in certain senses I'm in a position to tell God no. That's how I wind up sinning and doing unvirtuous and evil acts, by telling God no, I don't want to do the right thing. And I am free to do that. I certainly do that more often than I should. And so it does seem to me, with apologies to all my Thomist friends, that Alan is right that this distinction doesn't really work and ends up in a very deterministic viewpoint, which is, as I recall, actually what I said to Jonathan when he first started explaining the Thomistic viewpoint to me. And I think that really is where it comes down, is it just ends up being determinism by another name, like Alan was saying. Now, moving on to open theism, I thought, interestingly enough, that one of the main objections that Peter Rather had raised against open theism is that if it is true, he says, at some point, God's going to have to step in and override people's free will. He's going to have to step in and stop them from doing certain things, and it's just going to have to necessarily be the case that at some point he uses his power and intervenes and prevents people from doing what they want to do. And what's interesting is that it seemed to me that Alan was more or less conceding that and saying, yeah, that's just how open theism works. That's just how I see things working in Scripture. So here's Alan talking about that.
He said, well, yeah, there's places where you're going to have to do a little bit of creative hermeneutics, and that pretty much applies to all these views. So
yeah, I can add a bit more specificity there. So I think if you look at the different cases of predictions or prophecies in Scripture, that the open theist has a number of strategies that he can use, depending, on the case at hand. One, and this alludes to like the passage from Jeremiah that I read, Jeremiah 18, is that a lot of predictions that appear to be categorical may in fact be conditional.
Oh, okay.
Right. One case in point of this is the where the prophet went to Hezekiah and told him, you're about to die, so it's time to put your house in order. And so he went and he prayed and he pleaded with God, please don't kill me. And the prophet who had walked away was sent back to Hezekiah and told, okay, I'm going to add 15 more years. Right. So initially this looked like a categorical type declaration. Your time's up. And it turns out it wasn't.
Yeah, seemingly the most easy, straightforward interpretation of that is Hezekiah prayed and God changed his mind, which doesn't sit well with some of the other models, but sits fairly well with an open theistic model.
Yeah. Another route an open theist could take is to say, well, that some of these predictions or prophecies may just be, may just be reflections of God's kind of unilateral intention to bring something about. God's going to make sure it happens one way or the other.
So it would be like when, I don't know, one of the Roman emperors would say to the barbarians, I'm going to come there and destroy you. He doesn't know that the future in the sense, but he has the power where he can probably make that happen if he's determined enough.
Yeah, it may still be an open question of exactly how and when the destruction is going to happen, but it's a settled fact that it's going to occur
because he has the power and means to do it. Yeah. I see. Okay.
One sort of case in point that I could allude to is the case of Balaam, and his donkey and stuff. He had been commissioned by one of the hostile kings around Israel to issue a curse upon Israel, and I guess he was traveling somewhere on his donkey to go and do that. And God somehow spoke to him and told him, "Don't do this." And he went and he proceeded on his way, and God, I guess, appeared as an angel or something, so the donkey was able to see this, and the donkey stopped, and and he beats his donkey trying to get the animal to move, and finally the donkey speaks to him, why are you hitting me? And it seemed that God directly kind of intervened at this point and put a roadblock, as it were, in his way, so he couldn't do something that he wanted to do, had intended to do, but God decided he wasn't going to do it. He wasn't going to allow that to happen. So I'm, sure there are ways that God can and does sort of steer events, even if necessary, by overriding or blocking the exercise of people's will, if that's what it takes to accomplish a certain result or prevent a certain result. I think predictions or prophecies could also be understood as just kind of consequences of causally determined trends that are in place. For example, I would I would appeal to this to help explain one of the verses that's often used as a problem case for open theism, which is the threefold denial of Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there's no compelling reason to think that at that time that Peter was completely free to do otherwise. Given his state of mind and the pressure he was under, it seems to me at least quite plausible that under the circumstances where his faith was tested, he couldn't realistically have done anything other than deny Christ. And then at the end of that, after he denied Christ, all that God had to do was to go and poke a chicken so that it would crow, and the prophecies fulfilled. Now that might involve a little bit of creative hermeneutics, but I don't think it's outside the realm of plausibility.
I guess you would, maybe, I don't know if this would be your words, but it would be like you would want to say, sure, it was logically possible for Peter to not deny Christ then, but it was no longer causally possible, if I could return to a distinction you were making earlier. Would that be right? Okay.
Yeah, say something along those lines.
And now, before I finish commenting and critiquing on open theism here, this reminds me of another interesting point that I saw, which is when Alan was critiquing simple foreknowledge, he was essentially saying all the things that Philip saw as virtues of simple foreknowledge were detriments to it. That is, the very reasons why, it seemed to me at least, Philip was saying simple foreknowledge is the way to go, were the very reasons why Alan was saying, no, that's why simple foreknowledge doesn't work. And so here's a clip of Alan critiquing simple foreknowledge, and just compare that to the description of simple foreknowledge that I had played of Philip giving earlier. So what's your take on that one?
Well, I've given you my main problems with it. I think it's right that it does solve the problem of PDF, or the problem of divine foreknowledge, by denying the unpreventability of the future specifier. But it has one liability. One is that because God's foreknowledge on this view is ontologically dependent on the actual occurrences of creaturely free choices, it is providentially useless with respect to those choices. The simple foreknowledge view offers God no providential advantage over open theism. I think its only alleged advantage is that it's maybe more in line with traditional views of divine, of God's, of the foreknowledge of God. And therefore, you can run the open theism is not sufficiently a traditional objection there, and find some leverage. But beyond that, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it runs into a grounding problem and an explanatory dependence problem, right? So we ask, what, in virtue of what is it true now that, some future contingent event happens tomorrow? Well, it can't be in virtue of any system of causes in place now, because we're assuming this is a future contingent event, nor can, it seems to me, be true in virtue of the event tomorrow, unless we suppose that event tomorrow already exists. So we have to help ourselves to a block theory of time. But that's going to run into a problem, because how is a block theory of time to be reconciled with future contingency? If you have a block, all these events exist, and you want to avoid fatalism, like the block provides you a future specifier. So to avoid fatalism, you have to say that the contents of that block are now unpreventable, at least insofar as they pertain to future contingents. But anything that's ontologically dependent on a future contingent is going to be itself a future contingent.
Mm-hmm.
So if the contents of this static block are dependent on future contingent events, then the block itself can't be a static block.
Yeah, I see.
It's so there's a tension there between the block theory of time and future contingency, but without the block theory of time, you have no grounding for the truth of the propositions about future contingents.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that grounding problem, and then I think you have the kind of explanatory dependence problem that seems to get things backwards, and to put you into some kind of system backward causation, that somehow events at a future point can retroactively are able to bring about not only something's having been true all the way in the past, but it's having been believed by God all the way in the past. And I just don't see how causation or can plausibly be thought to work that way.
Okay, so I hope you heard the same point I did there, which is Alan says simple foreknowledge doesn't seem to work because it necessitates a backward causation where things in the future can cause things in the past, which seems intuitively wrong to him, and to me as well. Well, when you heard Philip describe simple foreknowledge, he was actually arguing for that very position, saying, hey, things in the future can affect things in the past. That's what he was trying to get at with this time machine example. That's why he was trying to say having an omniscient God is like the time machine. It makes things weird. Now, what this reminds me of is a point that Ben Arbour made way back in episodes 22 and 23, where he and I were discussing the ontological argument, and what he said is one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tonens. And loosely speaking, what that means is, suppose you have an argument that goes, if A, then B, someone might look at that in the affirmative sense and say, well, we have A, therefore B. Now, someone else might want to look at that same argument in a negative sense and say, no, not B, therefore not A. When you have points like this, if somebody is going to accept certain premises, that leads them some way, and another person can turn around and deny those premises and then say, therefore that's wrong. And that's what I see going on here with Peter's objection to open theism, saying, well, at some point, God's just going to have to come in and override people's free will. And Alan's like, well, yeah, that's just the way it is under open theism. I accept that. In fact, I'm trying to argue for that as a virtue of open theism. And it's the same thing between Alan and Philip on simple foreknowledge, where Philip is saying, well, yeah, for simple foreknowledge to work, there has to be this backward causation, and Alan is turning around and saying, but there can't be this backward causation, so simple foreknowledge is wrong. So what are my conclusions after all this? Well, it seems to me that the viewpoints that are the most philosophically defensible and reasonable are Molinism, simple foreknowledge, and open theism. I don't find Calvinism very reasonable because it redefines free will so that we're not really free and it's essentially deterministic, and it makes God into kind of a moral monster by him holding us responsible for things that we just could not have done otherwise. And since God's not a moral monster, he's just, then I have to conclude there's something wrong with that viewpoint. Now, while I don't think the Thomistic response works, and that I don't think that distinction that it's trying to appeal to between the creature and the divine that Jonathan was going through, I don't think that works, but I also don't find that an objectional view like I do with Calvinism, because it's not like it's turning God into a moral monster and claiming we're not free. I think it just doesn't really solve the problem. I think it makes kind of a philosophical mistake. So I would definitely rate that as a better view than Calvinism, at least according to me. Now, I'm sure my Thomist friends who listen to this are going to turn around and tell me that I haven't understood the view because, well, it's a running joke that people say that Thomists are always saying you don't understand Aquinas, and hey, maybe I haven't, and if so, write in, tell me about it. I'll read your comments on Facebook or emails you send me explaining why I didn't understand the view. I've tried, and if you tell me I haven't understood it, I'll try again. Now, between Molinism, open theism, and simple foreknowledge, I think there's substantive objections to all of those views. I went through the objections to Molinism a little more in depth here, partially because it seemed to me the reasonable objections to simple foreknowledge Philip just kind of took for granted and said, yeah, I'm going to run with these, where the good objections to open theism, Alan kind of responded by saying, yeah, I'm going to take that and just run with it as well, which, hey, good for them. They're being honest, good philosophers. But conversely with Molinism, it seems like everybody's kind of recognizing, well, yeah, if these problems are there and unanswerable, they really are problems. So that's a little bit of a different animal. Now, as I've said many times before on this podcast, there is no viewpoint you can take in philosophy, theology, politics, or anything where there isn't some objection that somebody can raise. And in a certain sense, that's kind of how I view open theism, simple foreknowledge, and Molinism here, where, yeah, reasonable people can and have argued for these, but reasonable people have also raised objections. So, where in my mind am I now? Well, I will say that these three definitely strike me as the most reasonable and defensible, and if you put a gun to my head right now and made me choose, I'd probably go with Molinism, because it seems to me the objections to it are so philosophically nuanced that makes me suspect the people who are raising them might just be splitting hairs, and that these objections might truly be answerable. I think maybe there might really be something in the response that John gave that could not only solve the grounding problem, but possibly even solve the objections that Philip and Alan raised. Now, conversely, with open theism, I kind of probably should be sympathetic to that one, because Alan and I hold the same view of time, or at least a similar view of time, in that I don't really think the future is there in the same sense that Philip does either. I don't hold to an eternalist view of time. So that should probably make me a little more sympathetic to open theism. But on the other hand, I find simple foreknowledge to be a little bit more elegant and philosophically pleasing to me. So I kind of go back and forth between the two of them, because I can see some virtues and vices on both of them. So I'm going to keep thinking about this quite a bit, and who knows, maybe another year or two I'll change my mind and decide, nah, you put a gun to my head, I'm going to go with simple foreknowledge or open theism. Or maybe my Thomist friends will write in and I'll have to do another couple of episodes explaining how I got the Thomist perspective all wrong. And hey, if so, that's great. More content for the podcast. So, why don't you now write in and let me know what you think. Which viewpoint do you take to be the best, and why? And what did you think of my idea of doing a series here where I explored all these various viewpoints and looked at all of them? Was it a series you enjoyed? Would you like to see more series like this? Are you aware of any viewpoints that I left out that I should have included? Write in and let me know what you think. As always, you can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for it and you'll find it. And, if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, share it on your social media and give it a like or a review or whatever's appropriate for the podcast app you're listening to on it, because the more reviews and likes and stuff I get, the more it gets out to more people, and the more it gets out to more people, the better, because philosophy is a great thing to get out to people. So I'll leave you with one final clip here that came from Philip and I's discussion, which I think we could say summarizes all of the reasonable viewpoints on this subject.
Yeah,
You and I would a total mess of it if we were in that situation.
Yeah, everybody who takes any viewpoint on this subject all agrees God is extremely smart. So right. No doubt about that. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.